And I'd like to introduce tonight's speaker, Nikki Böhler. She's studied economics at the University of St. Gallen, and she's founded a social business club there and is also involved with effective altruism in Switzerland. And she now works at the UBS Optimus Foundation in Zurich. Welcome, Nikki Böhler.
Thank you very much. So today I'm going to talk about behavioral economics. I am not sure how knowledgeable you are in the field of economics, so I'm first going to give you a short introduction about what economics is. Economics is the study of production and consumption of goods and how the transfer of wealth determines how much is produced and who obtains these goods. The two main fields of study that exist within economics are macroeconomics, which takes a really general perspective on the economy. It's about whole countries, nations, their activities, and really generalized parameters such as money, inflation, etc. Today we're mainly going to focus on microeconomics. Microeconomics is about the actions of individuals, industries, or corporations, and it tries to explain how they make their decision within the markets. I have to focus on microeconomics because behavioral microeconomics is much more developed, and it's also much easier to grab since it's really concerned with the individual and its decisions, and it's easier to integrate psychology into this, but it also exists behavioral macroeconomics. So the prevalent approach that exists in economics is mainly neoclassical economics. They developed a concept called homo economicus. This concept assumes that we individuals hold correct beliefs and use the laws of probability and statistics perfectly, which means we make the perfect decisions. We have well-defined, stable, and non-conflicting preferences, which means we know what we really want. And we always maximize the utility or the expected utility. Neoclassical economics are convinced that these assumptions are enough, that they satisfy the needs of economics, since you can make good predictions about the behavior of economic decision makers. And they think that it's useless and not a good idea to integrate psychological insights or to improve these assumptions, even if they are aware of the fact that they are not perfect, since it would make the field too complex and it wouldn't really help or support their field of study. The problems that exist with this approach that you probably all know is that we are not perfect. Most of us don't really know what they want, and if we would know what we want, we wouldn't really know how to get it. And if we would know how to get it, we wouldn't really have all the capabilities and competences that are necessary to get it the way we want it. Furthermore, the circumstances are not optimal for our decision-making process. Most of the times we only take a decision once, so we are not able to learn from it and to improve it. The environment is always changing, so we're not really sure what we can expect from our environment, and we don't always get feedback, so we don't really know if we make good or bad decisions. And furthermore, there are a lot of corporations which are using psychological insights to make us behave in the way that they want, which we cannot really control. All in all, our decisions probably are fundamentally different from what economists expect or have assumed until now. This is why the field of behavioral economics developed. The field of the behavioral economics is trying to analyze and determine how people or individuals really behave, how they make their decisions, and it's really concerned with the bounds of rationality. It starts from carefully considered and psychologically well-grounded assumptions, and then continues the economical, the process of economics, and thereby it expands and improves the insights that already exist. So it's not trying to destroy or get rid of the theories that exist, but to improve them and to work on them. I'll show a short movie from Dan Ariely. He will give you his perspective on the field of behavioral economics.
Behavioral economists are interested in the same topics that economists are interested in. Why people buy, how we make decisions, what are the right mechanisms in the market, and so on. But the starting point is different. Rather than assuming people are rational and then take the implications of that, we have no prior beliefs. We say, let's just see how people behave. Let's put them in a situation in the lab, in the field. Let's see how they behave. And then as a consequence, let's make the implication. And because in those situations, people often don't behave rationally, the implications are often very different from the implications from standard economics.
So it all sounds really great and logical, but there is also a lot of criticism about this field. A few concerns that exist are that people do act quite rational in some circumstances in the economy. So a lot of economists think that you can only apply behavioral economics in a really limited way. It's not giving a generalized view on the economy, which is necessary to develop models and concepts of whole markets. And they are afraid that the experiments that behavioral economics focus on, that they are not perfect and that they are also bound to biases, etc. So it may not really improve the predictions that we make. Before I go into detail into the field, I will quickly tell you how all of this is used. First of all, it improves our understanding of the customer and their decisions, and therefore also improves the models of economists to predict what's going to happen in the economy and in the market. It's also a powerful mechanism to influence consumer decisions. That's why it's used or researched by corporations, and it improves our own decision-making process when we are aware of the boundaries of our rationality. Negative aspects is that it makes us realize that it's really hard to predict anything that individuals do, since there are a lot of aspects that play within our decision-making process. There are a lot of new models that are needed. The field is still really young, so there's a lot of work to do, and right now we couldn't really focus only on this field because not all the concepts exist that are necessary. And it can also be used by corporations to deceive their customers. So now let's look at concrete examples. So basically, behavioral economics is about integrating insights of psychology into economics. How can this be done? Since economics and psychology have really different assumptions. So first of all, behavioral economists assume that human behavior is individual-based and goal-driven, which means that we try to understand our environment and try to maximize our well-being within the constraints that we have. And the components that we look at are what makes us happy, how do we make trade-offs, what do we believe about our environment, and how do we put all of this together in order to make a decision. So behavioral economics is mainly about analyzing and predicting these components. Now the problem is that there are various relevant concerns if we try to determine these components. There is our individuality, there are the circumstances, there are general barriers that exist, there is time and risk involved. So how can we really determine what's going to happen, or how do behavioral economics approach this problem? So first of all, we start with basically an experiment. We put people into a room and try to see how they react on different inputs that we give. An example would be the dictator game. A dictator game is a game in which only one individual determines the outcomes of the game. So, for example, if I would give someone of you $10 and I would tell you, you can split this $10 however you like to with your neighbor, how are you going to react? And then I see the results. You keep $8.2 for yourself and you give $1.8 away to your neighbor. Now I'm going to think, why are you doing this? What is your motivation behind it? So what very often happens, and what also happened in this experiment, is that we realize, okay, with this experiment we cannot really predict why people made this decision. It could be either because you like your neighbor, because you care about your neighbor. It could also be about your distributional preferences. So you're concerned about fairness and you want everyone to have the same amount of money in this case. It could also be about your reputation, that you want to make a good impression on your neighbor. So then what's very often the case is that we have to go back to point one and do another experiment which is similar and gives us more insights about the background of the decision. So for example, the researchers, in the next case, they ask the individuals, what would you prefer? Would you prefer to get $10 or to do the dictator game, in which you can decide if you give some money to your neighbor? And in the first case, your neighbor wouldn't know that you decided not to play the game. So then only $0.8 go to your neighbor instead of $1.8. So we realize that the reputation and the impression that you make on your neighbor is a really important aspect of why you made this decision. So this process could go on and on. It very often also goes on, and in most of the cases in behavioral economics, the decisions or the process is not finished yet. It will never be finished, but at a certain point they get confident about their hypothesis and about their assumptions, and they really precise what can they conclude out of the experiment. As for example, people don't only think about themselves but only about others, especially if their reputation is on the stake. And as a last step, economists think about how can we now use this new insight that we have to improve our models, to make assumptions about the markets, etc. So this is the typical structure of thinking in behavioral economics. Now I'm going to give a concrete example of an economics model that has been improved or updated by behavioral economics. I'm going to talk about expected utility function. I hope that some of you are aware of this function. It tries to predict the behavior of individuals in decisions where risk is involved. So when you have multiple options to take, you want to know how much utility am I going to have out of the different actions that I can take. And it assumes that you can calculate this utility or this value that you receive by multiplying the utility that you get out of the outcome of your action or out of a possible outcome of your action times the probability that this outcome is going to happen. As for example, I was this evening at the metro station and I wanted to buy a sandwich, and there is a new sandwich that I don't know. So I'm thinking, should I buy this sandwich or not? So there is a pretty high possibility that I'm not going to like the sandwich, let's say 60%, and then I'm going to have a negative utility out of it because I have a sandwich that I'm going to eat in the train because it's the only thing I'm going to have, and I'm not going to be happy about it. So the utility, let's say, is -3. And then there is also the possibility that I'm going to love this new sandwich and I'm going to buy it all time from now on. So then I'm going to have really positive utility, +9, and the probability is 40%. So this is how you can, in the end, calculate, should I make this decision or not? So if your expected utility is positive, you're going to buy this new sandwich. And the assumptions that we take to make these decisions are, on one hand, that only the final outcomes matter. So you take the utility only out of the final outcome that's going to happen, and that there is a linearity in probabilities, which means that you get twice as much utility or value out of an event when it is twice as probable to happen. So both of these assumptions are very critical and shouldn't be put like that. I'm going to focus now on the assumption that only final outcomes matter and tell you what's the problem with it and how it has been realized that there's a problem with it. So if you think that only final outcomes matter to get utility out of a decision or an action, then what would you expect if I give randomly half of you a mug and you decide the buying and selling price for these mugs? Normally you should think that the buying and selling price should be equal, that everyone should only care about the final outcome, which is, do I have a mug or money in the end of this game? But what really happens is that people who have a mug in their hand think that it is their proper mug, and they value it much more than people who don't have a mug in their hand, since they have a different reference point. So in the end, people with a mug value the mug double as much as people without a mug. So this is because people are more sensitive to losses than they are to gains, which shows that it is not only about the final outcomes, but also about the state that you are in before the decision, which is basically the reference point. To illustrate you this point about the reference, I'm gonna make a short experiment with you. Could please half of the people, let's say this half, close their eyes until I tell them to open them? Okay. So people on the left side, please make a decision about the two options that you have. It's basically the two options: have a gamble or not gamble. So who of you wouldn't want to gamble? Who of you would take the secure option? Could you keep your hands up? Okay, and who of you would take the gamble? Okay, so now the other half of the sides can open their eyes. So now same for you. So who of you would take the secure option, of losing 500 francs? And who of you would gamble? Okay. So now let's see, you're also going to see the question of the other type. In your case, like almost 50%, it was almost a 50-50% decision in the first case. instead of 16% in the experiment with more people under better circumstances. And on the right-hand side, all of the people who made a decision decided to go for the gamble, which is going in the direction of this experiment. The thing is that both questions have the same final outcomes. In both questions, you have either 1,500 for sure, or you have 1,000, something between either 1,000 or 2,000. So if you think that only final outcomes matters, you should think that the decision should be 50-50, but this is not the case. People who have less, they put much more value in gaining something than people who have more, which is part of the diminishing sensitivity, which means that the more you have, the less you value additional gains or additional wealth. So this experiment showed that there is a really critical point between 1,000 and 2,000. That people with 1,000 Swiss francs don't see themselves as rich already, whereas people with 2,000 already feel very comfortable about their amount of money, which is why they are more willing to risk and less risk averse, since they don't think about losing, but much more about gaining. So to give you a summary of reference dependence is about gaining a utility out of a change instead of out of a final outcome. Another really typical example that I would like to say is that if two people have $1,000, you could assume that both people have the same value. But if one of these people first gained $3,000 and then was taking $2,000 away, he's going to be much less happy than someone who first lost $2,000 and then gained additional $3,000. So it is not only about the final outcome, but also about a certain reference point. And this leads to loss aversion as well as diminishing sensitivity. And Kahneman was involved in both experiments that I just mentioned. And he, together with Tversky, developed the prospect theory, which is really famous in behavioral economics. The prospect theory basically puts these two new insights together in order to calculate the utility, which really differs from the way it has been calculated by the expected utility function. So now we have a really new model which shows that people value gains more than losses, which is why the side of the losses is much steeper than the side of the gains. And the concave form of this formula shows that the diminishing sensitivity. It shows that we value additional gains much less, or additional losses much less, and when we already have a lot of gains or a lot of losses. So this prospect theory was put together into the expected utility theory in order to develop a new model, a new function, and a new formula to calculate the decisions that we make. So, for example, it would value losses double as much as gains depending on the situation. So you always have to multiply losses by 2 within the function. Another part of the expected utility theory that I shortly mentioned that wasn't really correct was the linearity and probabilities, that they assume that you value something twice as much when it is twice as probable. So there they went to the same or a really similar process. They made a lot of experiments, they updated their beliefs, and their insights again and again, and they are now at the moment where they realize that we overestimate small percentages, small probabilities, a lot opposed to hyper probabilities, which we under-evaluate. So we don't really take value directly out of the probabilities, but our mindset is changing these probabilities into different values, which do not correlate with the expected utility function. But I'm going to stay with this example now with the prospect theory and the reference dependence. And I want to make a really important point in behavioral economics. As I already mentioned before, it's a really young field, and not everything has been decided yet. Not even all the questions have been asked yet. So no one can really explain what the reference point is or how we can determine it, which would be completely necessary to develop a function or a formula that builds on the reference point. So the field of research is really increasing strongly, but there are almost no certain predictions about the reference point, and economists do not know yet how to calculate it, which is why a lot of formulas and models cannot be developed yet within the field of behavioral economics. So this was the presentation. I am already at the end of it. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask. Otherwise, I would also have another example open. This is a typical behavioral economics joke. There are a lot of them, and I really like them. So, do you have any questions that we could talk about or discuss on?